Hi, everyone. A year ago, I started using Chat GPT for my risk management job. What I quickly found is that because Chat GPT is trained on a broad list of sources related to risk management, it captures both the good and the bad. As a result, many of the answers I was getting through Chat GPT were very much risk management one. It was somewhat like hearing the wisdom of crowds, including strategies that had already been proven ineffective through scientific research, publications, books, or my personal experience in backtesting. I discovered that certain practices made absolutely no sense, were a waste of time, and yet ChatGPT kept suggesting them as best practices. A year ago, I set out on a task to create a fine-tuned model within ChatGPT, or perhaps external to ChatGPT. At that time, I hadn't decided. That would incorporate knowledge vetted by me from the Risk Academy blog, YouTube channel, and close to 1,000 blogs and videos, along with 5 years of Risk Awareness Week workshops. That's close to 200 workshops from speakers, risk professionals, and decision professionals vetted by Alex Sidorenko. What I came up with was a chatbot which provided much more reasonable, practical, and importantly, much more useful answers about risk management, integrating risk management into decision-making, using risk analysis and various quantitative risk analysis techniques to improve the quality of decision-making, planning, budgeting, contingency calculations, and performance management. Then, I spent a year interviewing different users who use this Risk Awareness Wisdom Bot, or RAW, at AI every day. What I found is that people tend to split into two distinctly different applications, and I wanted to compare the two in this short video. I also wanted to share my opinion on which application is much more useful, much more practical, and why I think some people don't fully utilize this super powerful tool. So there are two applications. The first application is basically a methodology advisor. People come in, ask questions like, "What is risk management to?" And it gives you responses like, "Risk management to is all about using risk analysis in the context of making decisions as opposed to in the context of risk governance, where you have to generate some sort of quarterly or monthly risk report. Instead, in risk management to, you perform smaller, quicker, sometimes more quantitative risk analyses, which are specifically targeted at the decision at hand. The budget, the business plan, the investment proposal, choosing which raw material to use, A or B, choosing different logistical routes. That's risk management too." This first application is where people seek to learn how to make risk appetite practical. They are essentially looking for a methodology advisor to get better ideas on how to integrate these concepts into decision-making. Here are some pre-made questions you can use. These are all examples of how to do something in risk management, and that's the first application. It's useful, it's educational, and many people tell me in the interviews that that's exactly how they use chatbots, our chatbot as well as other chatbots. And that's fine. But what I think is a much more useful and practical application of chatbots, and this is where I think some risk managers are not yet making the connection, is to actually supplement your day-to-day work, not just for educational purposes, but for practical day-to-day work supplemented with the chatbot. Think of a chatbot, view RAW at AI as a junior risk manager. Just like you would have a conversation with a junior risk manager, you would ask them to go and research something, draft a risk identification checklist, help me paraphrase these risks into a format that would be useful for us to use in the risk report or in some sort of information memo. So using a chatbot not for educational purposes, not to help you as the risk manager understand something, but rather for you as the risk manager to outsource your day-to-day activities to the chatbot. Now let me give you an example. We are conducting a tender to select a transportation company to transport mine personnel from the base to the mine. I want to integrate risk analysis into the tendering and procurement process. Help me identify the risks I should be asking as part of the request for proposal. That's an activity that a typical risk manager would perform on a day-to-day basis. There's a large contract, and you know the value is going to be significant. it poses a significant reputational, environmental, and safety risk. Obviously, it clearly is an operational risk because any sort of delay will have an immediate impact on the operations. So you would typically integrate it into the procurement process, and you would create a checklist or a list of risks that would go into the RFP, into the request for proposal documents, so that each of the potential vendors has an opportunity to respond to it and to provide you with additional supporting information on how they're planning to address these risks. And then whatever risks cannot be eliminated, how these risks will be reflected in the draft contract and the performance criteria, or SLA, with that vendor. Let's take a look at the response. We can see delays and breakdowns in transportation. That's a great question to include in the RFP. Also, safety performance is clearly another good question. This gives me ideas. There's a golden rule when talking to chatbots. Never rely on the first response. Always dig deeper and always try to find out more by asking, "Tell me a little bit more about this topic. Let's do this for the sake of it." Help me deep dive into this risk below. What else should I be asking the potential vendors? How can this risk be mitigated through the contract? Here's the risk. Let's have a look at the previous contingency planning. What sort of replacements do they have, etc.? Is the company financially stable? Do they have tax liabilities and so on? Environmental impact and what sort of equipment they're using and so on. Capacity. If we suddenly introduce a third shift, are they physically able to produce? Do they have any compliance issues, any reputational issues in the past? And so let's have a look if it helped us. So additional questions. Safety culture, audits, inspections. That's good. Employee training, super important. Emergency preparedness, again, very important. How can this be mitigated inside the contract? The whole idea of identifying risks as part of procurement is to know your risks up front for each significant contract. This allows you to either eliminate these risks or mitigate them through existing service level agreements or contracts. If a risk cannot be mitigated, disclose it to the decision-making body, saying, "These are the risks we have identified." For example, we identified 5 risks. 4 out of 5 risks we were able to mitigate through specific clauses in the contract or requiring specific insurances or requesting additional documentation. We're happy that these risks are acceptable. And then 1 risk we couldn't mitigate through the contract, so we're disclosing it to your decision makers. When you make the decision, you have to be conscious that this risk, we are taking it, we're absorbing it. Audit rights, again, vendor regular training and shares training records with you. I mean, incident records. These are very basic because I'm using a basic example for illustration purposes, but very, very useful examples on how I've just outsourced investigation and some research to a junior risk analyst, like I normally would, except Risk Awareness Week chatbot or Risk Academy Wisdom bot has done it in half the time. And it's very nicely phrased, very nicely structured, so I can kind of copy-paste it and go indirectly into the RFP. Now I think the best part of it is, can you give me the last question? Let me be a little bit more specific so we don't derail it. Here's the question. What emergency? Give me this question in Spanish, in case I wanted to copy-paste it into the RFP, which is done in a different language, which is, in fact, the case with most organizations, which may have a head office in English and then operations in a different local language. Okay, what else may you want to outsource? So I have an FMEA workshop next week facilitated by an external consultant. Give me suggestions for preparation. The topic is environmental controls. So it gives me some ideas on what I would want to investigate. This is great, and in other videos, I will unpack each of these specific examples. Now, historical incident data. You can actually load historical incident data into another chatbot, which I'll share in a different video. This chatbot at the moment is limited to text input, so you can technically input some numbers and it will perform the calculations, but it doesn't allow you to load in an Excel or CSV data file, so it's limited to text interaction. So it's literally you talking to a junior risk manager, and this is what I'm finding, that people who use chatbots, including our chatbot, as a junior risk assistant rather than just an educational piece for the risk manager themselves, get a lot more value out of this, because this can really streamline the process. Okay, here's another example. I need to draft a quick risk management policy aligned with ISO 31000. It will be published on the company website. I need to a quick outline, but before that, suggest 5 questions that would improve my prompt. This is always a good idea to not just give directions to the chatbot, but use the power and the knowledge behind the chatbot to brainstorm some ideas first before you make the prompt. So I find it useful to ask the chatbot to tell me what I should be considering for the activity I need to perform before giving the actual task to the chatbot. Okay, that's great. Now let's make sure it covers these 5 points from the previous answer. I will copy part of the previous request and answer. It actually went further than just giving an outline. It created almost a full, short policy, which shouldn't be that long. Okay, not all of this is useful. I mean, key stakeholders will need to be rewritten, but again, think of this as your junior risk assistant. It tries to do the right job the first time, but usually it doesn't succeed. So you go back and forth a few times and you reach the final result much quicker. So decision-based risk analysis, assumptions monitoring, quantitative risk analysis, again, these will need to be rewritten, and we'll have a separate extensive video on how to create a proper decision-focused risk policy using chatbots. Personnel, technology, structure, governance, responsibilities, continuous improvements, references. It's not a poor skeleton. So imagine you just sent an email to your junior assistant saying, "Can you please brainstorm and draft some ideas on what should be included in the risk policy, research what our competitors are doing, and let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's use a format that is consistent with what other listed companies in our industry are using for their risk policies." And this is what it came up with. And then you can continue prompting it to tailor it to your organization and focus on specific aspects of risk management that are important. So let me summarize this. Based on the interviews I have conducted, after a year of thousands of people using the chatbot we created, I am observing 2 types of applications. The basic one is where risk managers ask methodology questions and try to learn something from the chatbot for their own benefit. Essentially, it's just the chatbot and them. They derive full value. That's one application. Then there's the second application, where the risk manager outsources specific activities to the chatbot, and the chatbot performs these activities. Then the output of that work is validated by the risk manager and used for communicating with all other stakeholders and integrating into the actual decision-making process. And I think this is where the real value lies.